Would drown east the broken machine. The January wind cut through the Vosges mountains like a blade made of ice and regret, carrying with it the distant thunder of German artillery that had been hammering the 3rd Infantry Division's positions for 3 days straight. Second Lieutenant Audie Murphy crouched in a foxhole carved from frozen earth and desperation, watching the snow fall on the broken remains of what had once been a quiet French farming village. Beside him, the machine gun lay silent and useless, its bolt mechanism seized solid from a combination of cold, dirt, and the kind of mechanical rebellion that always seemed to happen at the worst possible moments. Sergeant Collins had given up trying to fix it 20 minutes ago, his thick fingers too numb from the sub-zero temperatures to work the delicate internal mechanisms that meant the difference between holding their position and becoming another casualty statistic in some distant headquarters. The reconnaissance patrol that had started as 8 men was now down to 6, with Henderson and Martinez evacuated after a mortar round had turned their morning observation post into a crater. The mission had been simple enough on paper: establish eyes on the German positions across the valley, report troop movements, and return to friendly lines by noon. But the Wehrmacht had other plans, and those plans apparently included a full-scale counterattack that had cut Murphy's patrol off from the rest of their company. Murphy's hands worked methodically on the machine gun's bolt assembly, his fingers tracing the cold metal despite the futility that Collins had already demonstrated. Around him, the scattered remnants of his patrol pressed themselves against whatever cover the shattered landscape could offer. A stone wall here, an overturned farm cart there, the twisted wreckage of a German tank destroyer that had been knocked out weeks earlier but still dominated the road junction they were trying to hold. "It's no good, Lieutenant," Collins whispered again, his breath forming clouds in the bitter air. "That bolt's locked up tighter than a miser's purse. Must have taken shrapnel when that 88 started dropping rounds on us." Through the swirling snow, Murphy could see movement in the tree line across the valley. Field grey uniforms moving with the kind of professional discipline that marked veteran infantry rather than the green replacements that had become increasingly common in German units. These men knew what they were doing, and they were positioning themselves for an assault that would roll right over the American position unless something changed quickly. The machine gun represented more than just firepower. It was their lifeline, the one advantage that might allow 6 men to hold ground against what appeared to be a full company of German infantry supported by armor. Without it, they were just 6 riflemen with limited ammunition, cut off from friendly forces, facing an enemy that had every tactical advantage except time. Private Kowalski belly-crawled over from his position behind the stone wall, his rifle dragging in the snow behind him. "Lieutenant, I count at least 30 Krauts moving up through them pines, maybe more coming up the road from the east." Murphy nodded without taking his eyes off the machine gun. His mind was already calculating fields of fire, ammunition, expenditure rates, and the grim mathematics of a delaying action. The official doctrine was clear: when cut off and outnumbered, conduct a fighting withdrawal to rejoin friendly forces. But the nearest American positions were 2 miles back through open ground that was now dominated by German observation posts and artillery. The wind shifted, carrying with it the mechanical sounds of tracked vehicles moving through the forest. Somewhere in that white maze of pine trees and snow-covered trails, German armor was positioning itself for the final push that would clear this road junction and open the route for their counterattack against the 3rd Infantry Division's exposed left flank. Murphy's hands continued working on the bolt mechanism, driven by an intuitive understanding that their survival depended entirely on making this weapon functional again. Around him, his men fired occasional rifle shots to discourage German scouts from getting too close. But everyone understood that they were buying time with ammunition they couldn't spare. The morning sun climbed higher through the grey clouds, its weak light doing nothing to warm the frozen landscape or the men who defended it. Each passing minute brought new challenges: Ammunition running low, no radio contact with headquarters, and the growing certainty that they were facing forces far larger than their small patrol could handle through conventional tactics. Corporal Walsh crawled up from his position near the tank destroyer, his face grim beneath the rim of his helmet. "Lieutenant, maybe we should think about pulling back. That armor's getting closer, and we ain't got nothing that'll stop it if it comes down this road." Murphy looked up from his work, for the first time in 20 minutes, studying the faces of the men who had followed him into what was supposed to be a routine reconnaissance mission. They deserved honest leadership, not false optimism. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly, and conventional wisdom suggested an immediate withdrawal before German forces could completely surround their position. But something in the mechanical complexity of the machine gun's bolt assembly called to him, a puzzle that demanded solution despite the chaos erupting around them. His hands had found a rhythm in the work, methodically clearing debris and testing the action, with movements that seemed to flow from necessity rather than training. If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation, and stay with us for the next chapters. The bolt assembly finally yielded to Murphy's persistent work, debris clearing enough to allow the mechanism to cycle properly. As he worked the action several times, feeling the smooth operation return gradually, German voices echoed closer through the morning mist that clung to the Vosges Mountains, like a shroud over the frozen battlefield. Collins watched with growing hope as Murphy's hands moved with increasing confidence over the weapon that had seemed hopelessly broken just minutes before. "I'll be damned, Lieutenant." "How'd you know to do that?" Murphy didn't answer immediately, his attention focused on testing each component of the firing mechanism. The truth was that he couldn't explain the mechanical knowledge that had seemed to flow from desperation rather than any formal training. His hands simply understood what needed to be done, guided by an intuitive grasp of how machines failed and how they could be convinced to work again. The machine gun came to life with a satisfying metallic click as Murphy completed the final adjustment. Through the scope, he could see German infantry beginning their advance through the vineyard rows that stretched down the slope toward their position. The enemy moved with deliberate precision, using natural cover as they closed the distance between the tree line and the American defensive positions. 30-round bursts, Murphy called softly to Collins, who had taken up the ammunition handler's position. "Short, controlled fire. We need to make every belt count." The first German probe came 20 minutes later, a squad of infantry moving cautiously through the grapevines while machine gun fire from the tree line provided covering fire. Murphy's repaired weapon answered with precise bursts that forced the attackers to seek cover, disrupting their coordinated advance and buying precious time for the defenders. Private Williams, positioned near the overturned farm cart, called out over the sound of rifle fire. "More movement on the left flank, Lieutenant. Looks like they're trying to get around behind us." The tactical situation was developing exactly as Murphy had feared. The Germans were conducting a textbook assault against a fixed position, fixing the defenders with direct fire while maneuvering forces to attack from multiple directions. Against a full company with proper support, it was a reasonable plan. Against 6 men with limited ammunition, it was overwhelming force applied with professional competence. But the machine gun had become the anchor of their defense, its field of fire covering the most likely avenues of approach, while the riflemen protected the flanks. The weapon performed flawlessly now, cycling through belt after belt of ammunition as German attacks pressed closer to their position around the road junction that connected the scattered villages of the Vosges Mountains to the main supply routes. Kowalski's rifle cracked steadily from behind the stone wall, each shot carefully aimed at targets of opportunity in the advancing German force. "They got mortars setting up in that tree line," he called out during a brief lull in the firing. "Gonna start dropping rounds on us real soon." Murphy had already seen the mortar crews positioning themselves among the pines. The Germans were following doctrine, suppress the defenders with indirect fire, then assault under cover of the barrage. It was effective tactics, and it would work unless the American position could somehow disrupt the enemy's careful coordination. The sound of tracked vehicles grew louder, metal treads crunching through snow and frozen earth as German armor moved into supporting positions. Through gaps in the mist, Murphy could make out the angular silhouette of a Panzer IV positioning itself to provide direct fire support for the infantry assault that was clearly being prepared. "Contact left," Walsh called out, his rifle already speaking, as German infantry attempted to flank their position using a drainage ditch that ran parallel to the road. The movement was covered by machine gun fire from the tree line, but the Americans had expected it and were ready. Murphy traversed the repaired machine gun to engage the flanking force, its steady chatter cutting through the morning air with mechanical precision. The weapon that had seemed hopelessly broken an hour before now delivered the accurate, sustained fire that was their only advantage against overwhelming numbers. The German assault developed with professional competence over the next 30 minutes. Mortar rounds began falling around the American position with increasing accuracy, fragments of steel and frozen earth raining down as the defenders hugged whatever cover they could find. Between bombardments, infantry advanced by rushes, while armor provided overwatch from positions among the trees. Collins fed ammunition belts into the machine gun with practiced efficiency, his movements automatic despite the stress of combat and the bitter cold that made every action deliberate and careful. "Running low on ammo, Lieutenant. Maybe 6 belts left." The mathematics were becoming impossible. 6 men could not hold a road junction against a company of German infantry supported by armor, no matter how well the machine gun performed or how carefully they rationed their ammunition. But retreat across open ground under observation would be suicide, and the position they held was too important to abandon without orders. Murphy's hands never left the machine gun as he considered their options. The weapon had become an extension of his will, its mechanical reliability the only predictable element in a tactical situation that was deteriorating by the minute. Around him, his men continued to fight with the kind of stubborn competence that had carried the 3rd Infantry Division through months of combat in the European theatre. The morning sun climbed higher through the overcast sky, its weak light revealing the full scope of the German forces arrayed against their small defensive position in the Vosges Mountains. The German mortar barrage intensified as the sun reached its zenith over the frozen battlefield, each round landing closer to the American position, with the methodical precision of experienced artillerymen walking their fire onto target. Murphy pressed himself against the frozen earth as shrapnel whined overhead, the machine gun's tripod vibrating with each nearby impact. During a brief lull in the bombardment, Kowalski crawled over from his position, dragging his rifle through the snow. His face was pale beneath the grime and stubble of 3 days in the line. "Lieutenant, I've been watching them crouch through my scope. They got at least 2 companies moving up, plus that armor support we've been hearing." The tactical picture was becoming clear, and it wasn't encouraging. The German forces were conducting a deliberate attack against what they probably assumed was a larger American unit. The methodical mortar fire, the careful infantry advances, the positioning of armor support, all indicated that the enemy was treating this road junction as a significant obstacle rather than a minor delay. Murphy continued working the machine gun in short, precise bursts, each trigger pull conserving ammunition while maintaining the psychological pressure that kept German infantry from advancing too boldly. The weapon had become an extension of his tactical thinking, its mechanical reliability the foundation of their entire defense. "How much longer you think we can hold this position?" Collins asked during a reload, his hands working automatically to feed a fresh ammunition belt into the weapon's mechanism. It was a fair question that deserved an honest answer. The official doctrine called for a fighting withdrawal when faced with overwhelming force, but the nearest American positions were still 2 miles away through terrain that was now completely dominated by German observation and fire. Moving in daylight would be suicide. Staying in place might be the same thing, just slower. Private Williams called out from near the tank destroyer, where he'd been watching the eastern approach. "Movement on the road, Lieutenant. Looks like they're bringing up something heavy." Through the swirling snow and morning mist, Murphy could make out the distinctive profile of German armor moving carefully along the road that connected their position to the larger battle being fought across the Vosges Mountains. The methodical advance suggested experienced tank crews who understood the value of caution when dealing with unknown American defensive positions. The sound of diesel engines mixed with the crunch of treads on frozen earth as the German armor positioned itself for the final phase of the attack. Murphy had seen this sequence before: suppress with mortars, fix with machine gun fire, then assault under cover of direct fire from tanks or assault guns. Walsh worked his rifle with steady precision from behind the stone wall, each shot aimed at targets of opportunity among the German infantry. "They're getting ready for something big, Lieutenant. Been pulling back their forward elements for the last 10 minutes. The tactical signs were unmistakable. The Germans were consolidating their forces for a coordinated assault that would roll over the American position with overwhelming firepower. Against a full platoon with proper support, it might have been a difficult attack. Against 6 men with a single machine gun, it represented the kind of mathematical certainty that made defensive warfare a question of honor rather than tactics." Murphy's hands never left the machine gun as he watched the German preparations through the weapon's iron sights. Somewhere in that carefully orchestrated advance was the moment when individual courage would have to substitute for tactical impossibility, when one man's decision to stand or fall back would determine whether his fellow soldiers lived or died. The radio static from their damaged field telephone had been silent for hours, another reminder of their isolation from the larger battle being fought by the 3rd Infantry Division across this contested sector of the Vosges Mountains front. Whatever happened in the next hour, it would be decided by the men on this frozen ground with the weapons in their hands. Kowalski chambered another round and settled behind his rifle. "You know, Lieutenant, my old man always said that sometimes a man's got to decide what he's willing to pay for." It was an unexpectedly philosophical observation from a kid who'd grown up working in Detroit auto plants before the war changed everyone's assumptions about what life would demand from them. But the comment carried weight in their current situation, where every decision carried consequences measured in lives rather than tactical advantages. The machine gun cycled smoothly through another controlled burst, its mechanical reliability a constant in a world where everything else seemed uncertain. Murphy had repaired more than a weapon. He had restored their ability to influence events rather than simply endure them. Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. The German assault began with a crescendo of mortar fire that shook the frozen earth and sent fragments of steel whistling through the air above their defensive positions. Murphy hunched over the machine gun as debris rained down, his hands steady on the weapon, despite the chaos erupting around the road junction in the heart of the Vosges Mountains. When the barrage lifted, German infantry advanced in textbook formation, one squad providing covering fire while another moved by rushes through the vineyard rows, their field-grey uniforms barely visible against the snow-covered landscape. Behind them, the distinctive angular silhouette of a Panzer IV emerged from the tree line, its main gun traversing to engage the American position. Murphy's machine gun spoke first, its repaired mechanism cycling flawlessly as controlled bursts swept across the advancing infantry. The weapon's field of fire dominated the most direct approach to their position, forcing the German assault to fragment and seek cover among the grapevines and farm buildings that dotted the slope. "Tank round incoming!" Collins shouted, pressing himself against the frozen earth as the Panzer's main gun fired with a sharp crack that echoed off the surrounding hills. The high-explosive shell detonated against the stone wall where Kowalski had been positioned moments before, sending fragments of masonry spinning through the air and temporarily deafening everyone within 50 yards. When the smoke cleared, Kowalski was crawling toward a new position, his rifle still functional, but his face streaming blood from stone fragments. The German armor had revealed its position by firing, and Murphy immediately shifted his attention to the tank crew's vision blocks and machine gun ports. His repaired weapon might not penetrate the Panzer's frontal armor, but it could suppress the crew's ability to observe and coordinate with their supporting infantry. Williams worked his rifle from behind the overturned farm cart, picking targets among the German infantry as they attempted to advance under cover of their armor support. "They're trying to get around our right flank again, Lieutenant." The tactical situation was developing exactly as Murphy had anticipated. The Germans were conducting a coordinated assault with professional competence, using combined arms tactics that should have overwhelmed 6 American soldiers with limited ammunition and no anti-tank weapons. But the machine gun had become more than just a weapon. It was the psychological center of their defense, its steady fire creating the illusion of a larger force than actually occupied the position. German infantry hesitated and sought cover when its barrels swung toward them, buying precious seconds for the American riflemen to reposition and respond to each new threat. The Panzer fired again, this time targeting the machine gun position directly. Murphy felt the concussion as the shell passed overhead and detonated behind their position, showering them with frozen dirt and debris. The near miss left his ears ringing, but didn't affect the weapon's mechanical operation. Collins fed a fresh ammunition belt into the gun with practiced efficiency, despite the incoming fire. "That's our last full belt, Lieutenant. After this, we're down to rifle ammo and whatever we can scrounge." The mathematics were becoming impossible, but Murphy continued working the machine gun with methodical precision. Each burst was carefully aimed and controlled, conserving ammunition while maintaining the defensive fire that kept German infantry from advancing boldly across the open ground. Walsh called out from his new position near the damaged stone wall. "They're massing for a final push, Lieutenant. I count at least 20 men getting ready to rush us all at once." Through the machine gun's iron sights, Murphy could see the German infantry preparing for their assault. The enemy had taken casualties during their initial probes, but they still possessed overwhelming numerical superiority and the support of armor that the Americans couldn't effectively engage. The moment stretched out like a held breath. 6 American soldiers facing a company of veteran German infantry, supported by armor, holding a road junction that connected scattered villages across the Vosges Mountains to the main supply routes that sustained the 3rd Infantry Division's winter positions. Murphy's hands remained steady on the machine gun as German infantry began their final assault. The weapon that had been hopelessly broken 2 hours before now represented their only chance of survival. Its repaired mechanism cycling ammunition with mechanical reliability that never wavered despite the intensity of combat. The Panzer's machine gun opened up, its heavier rounds chewing chunks from the stone wall and forcing the American defenders to hug whatever cover they could find. Between the armor's suppressive fire and the advancing infantry, the tactical situation had reached the point where individual decisions would determine collective survival. Kowalski worked his rifle despite the blood streaming down his face, each shot carefully aimed at the advancing German infantry. Williams maintained steady fire from behind his overturned cart, while Walsh used the damaged stone wall to provide what cover it could still offer. But it was Murphy and the machine gun that held the center. the repaired weapon speaking with mechanical precision as German infantry closed the final distance to their defensive positions around the road junction that had become the focal point of a much larger battle. The machine gun's bolt seized again, just as German infantry reached the outer edge of their defensive perimeter, the weapon falling silent at the precise moment when its fire was most desperately needed. Murphy's hands worked frantically on the mechanism, while Collins continued feeding ammunition into a gun that could no longer cycle, the cruel irony of mechanical failure striking at the worst possible instant. But something had changed in the tactical situation during the past hour of fighting. The German assault, while professionally executed, had been based on the assumption that they were attacking a larger American force than actually held the road junction. The sustained resistance, centered around the machine gun's defensive fire, had convinced enemy commanders that they faced a reinforced position rather than 6 men with a single automatic weapon. "They're pulling back!" Kowalski called out, his voice filled with disbelief as he watched German infantry withdrawing under cover of smoke grenades rather than completing their assault on positions that could no longer effectively resist. Murphy continued working on the jammed bolt mechanism, his hands guided by the same intuitive understanding that had restored the weapon's function earlier. But his mind was processing the larger tactical picture. Why experienced German infantry would break off an attack just as they achieved tactical advantage? Through gaps in the smoke, he could see the panzer reversing into the tree line rather than pressing forward to overrun their position. German mortar fire had lifted, and the coordinated assault that should have swept over their defensive positions was fragmenting into withdrawal rather than victory. The answer came in the form of distant artillery fire from American guns, heavy shells passing overhead to bracket German positions in the tree line where armor and supporting infantry had concentrated for their attack. Someone in the 3rd Infantry Division's Fire Direction Center had finally located the radio communications that connected Murphy's isolated patrol to the larger battle. Williams crawled over from his position near the farm cart, his rifle smoking from sustained fire. "Lieutenant, that radio's been squawking for the past 10 minutes. Sounds like battalion's been trying to raise us." The field telephone that had been damaged during the initial German bombardment had somehow restored itself to marginal operation, crackling with static and garbled transmissions from higher headquarters. Collins worked the handset while Murphy continued his efforts to repair the machine gun's bolt mechanism. "This is Able 6, Collins spoke into the radio. "We're still holding the road junction, but we need immediate resupply and medical evacuation for wounded." The response was immediate and characteristic of military communications, a string of coordinates, unit designations, and tactical instructions that attempted to impose order on the chaos of combat. But the essential message was clear. Reinforcements were moving forward, and the isolated patrol's defense of the road junction had disrupted German plans for a larger counterattack. Murphy finally cleared the obstruction from the machine gun's bolt, working the action several times to ensure smooth operation. The weapon was functional again, but the immediate crisis had passed, with the German withdrawal under pressure from American artillery that had finally found its targets. Kowalski pressed a field, dressing against the cuts on his face, his hands shaky from adrenaline and relief. "How long you figure we've been holding this position, Lieutenant?" The question was harder to answer than it seemed. Time moved differently under fire, minutes stretching into hours, while entire tactical situations developed and resolved in seconds. Murphy's watch had stopped sometime during the mortar bombardment, its mechanism frozen by cold and shock, just as the machine guns had been. But the important measurement wasn't time. It was the fact that 6 men with a repaired machine gun had convinced a German company to abandon an attack that should have succeeded through overwhelming force. The psychological impact of sustained resistance had proved more effective than the mathematical reality of ammunition counts and casualty reports. Walsh moved carefully among their scattered equipment, collecting expended ammunition boxes and checking their remaining supplies. "We fired damn near everything we had, Lieutenant. If they'd kept coming for another 10 minutes, we'd have been down to throwing rocks." The machine gun sat quietly now, its bolt mechanism functioning perfectly after Murphy's second field repair under fire. The weapon had become more than just equipment. It represented the difference between helpless endurance and active resistance, between tactical defeat and the kind of stubborn defense that disrupted enemy plans. American artillery continued falling on German positions in the tree line, heavy shells that spoke of fire direction centers with accurate coordinates and ammunition supplies that dwarfed what Murphy's patrol had available for their defense. The larger battle was being fought with resources that made their small action seem almost insignificant by comparison. But tactical significance and human impact measured different things entirely. Relief arrived in the form of Sherman tanks and fresh infantry from the 3rd Infantry Division's reserve, their approach announced by the distinctive sound of American diesel engines and the sight of white stars painted on armored turrets. Murphy remained behind the machine gun until the lead tank reached their position, his hands reluctant to leave the weapon that had anchored their defense. Captain Harrison climbed down from the lead Sherman, his face grim as he surveyed the defensive position that 6 men had held against overwhelming odds. The scattered evidence of combat told its own story: expended ammunition boxes, crater marks from German mortar fire, and the debris of a battle that had lasted longer than anyone had expected. "How many casualties?" Harrison asked, his voice carrying the weight of a commander who had learned to expect the worst from isolated patrols. "2 evacuated early for wounds," Murphy replied, his hands still working methodically on the machine gun's action. "The rest of us are still functional." The captain studied the tactical situation with professional interest, noting fields of fire, German approach routes, and the improvised defensive positions that had somehow held against forces that should have overrun them within minutes. His trained eye could read the story of the battle in the placement of equipment and the patterns of incoming fire. Collins worked to police their scattered gear, while medics examined Kowalski's facial wounds and the exhaustion that marked all the survivors. "That machine gun saved our asses, Lieutenant. Couldn't have held without it working right." But Murphy knew the real story was more complex than equipment function and tactical positioning. Something in the desperate mathematics of the situation had transcended normal military logic, transforming 6 men with limited ammunition into a defensive position that convinced experienced German commanders to abort an attack that should have succeeded. The machine gun itself would continue serving throughout the war, its bolt mechanism a testament to field repairs performed under impossible conditions. But for Murphy, the memory of those crucial hours would carry a weight that no after-action report could fully capture. The knowledge that mechanical competence and tactical stubbornness had somehow substituted for resources they never possessed. Williams helped load their equipment onto the relief vehicles while American artillery continued falling on German positions across the valley. "You ever figure out why that gun kept jamming on us, Lieutenant?" The question had no simple answer. Combat equipment failed for 1,000 reasons: cold, dirt, metal fatigue, and the simple mechanical rebellions that seemed to occur at the worst possible moments. But it also responded to patience, understanding, and the kind of intuitive mechanical knowledge that couldn't be taught from manuals. Harrison completed his assessment of the position and approached Murphy with the expression of a commander preparing to write an after-action report that would somehow transform chaos into coherent narrative. "I'll need a full debrief when we get back to the command post. What you people did here disrupted their entire counterattack timetable." The larger tactical picture was beyond Murphy's immediate concern. His focus remained on the machine gun's mechanism, ensuring that the repairs would hold during transport and future operations. The weapon had performed flawlessly once its problems were resolved, cycling through hundreds of rounds without mechanical failure. As they loaded into the vehicles for transport back to friendly lines, Murphy caught a final glimpse of the road junction they had defended for what felt like hours, but measured only minutes on any official timeline. The position looked ordinary in afternoon light, just another intersection of farm roads in the contested landscape of the Vosges Mountains. But memory would transform that ordinary ground into something else entirely. A place where mechanical knowledge and tactical desperation had combined to achieve results that defied mathematical probability. The machine gun's steady operation had anchored a defense that existed more in German assumptions than American reality. Years later, Murphy would struggle to explain the sequence of repairs and tactical decisions that had made survival possible. The mechanical knowledge had seemed to flow from necessity rather than training, guided by hands that somehow understood what needed to be done when conventional solutions proved inadequate. In his personal effects, Murphy kept a small piece of the debris he had cleared from the bolt mechanism that morning, a tangible reminder of the moment when mechanical failure had threatened to become tactical disaster, and patient hands had made the difference between survival and catastrophe. The machine gun itself would outlast the war, its mechanism a testament to the reality that courage sometimes manifested in quiet technical competence rather than dramatic heroics, in the willingness to keep working when everything else suggested surrender. If this story reminded you that behind every medal there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.